My name again is Greg Whitcup. I'm the director of the Center for Collections and Research, and it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to one of our first, not the first, but virtual programs that we've done this fall. It's nice to be on the screen again with all of you. So you are in for a real treat tonight, as Kevin will not only tell you about the history of brick architecture, but then really take you on a virtual tour of this campus and point out some of these exquisite details, the likes of which even I have never noticed here at Cranbrook. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Kevin and let him discuss all things bricks with this great group of people. Kevin, the virtual podium is all yours.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. There we are. It's great to be back with all of you after some time away from the virtual podium here, where I discuss from my dining room all things Cranbrook. It's nice to see so many friends and family and celebrity textile conservators with us tonight. We'll be discussing the bricks of Cranbrook, and I am really excited to get into the weeds with you about this humble material and the monumental designs that it has created here at Cranbrook. Now, I've adapted the title of tonight's talk from John Ruskin's The Stones of Venice. Written in 1853, Ruskin's book is a treatise on Venetian architecture and the nature of the Gothic style. It is also a seminal text of the arts and crafts movement, from which Cranbrook is a descendant of this long arts and crafts legacy. But John Ruskin didn't care too much for bricks or brick architecture. So in his spirit, but not in his dismissive attitude of the brick, we will tonight be elevating brick and examining the bricks of Cranbrook. While in the history and hierarchy of architecture, brick has always been secondary to stone, timber, and even stucco, I personally have always been partial to bricks. There's a comforting honesty in clay brick. You can touch it, you can hold its weight, you can feel the texture. And the brick is such a modest and unpretentious and inclusive item. So what exactly is a brick? Well, I have one right here. It really is just earth. It's the humblest thing imaginable. And it's clay that is shaped or molded into a rectangular form, dried or fired in a kiln. A sun-dried brick is going to be much weaker than a kiln-fired brick. And then assembled, you have a whole different manufacturing technique and a whole different result. And that is a building. And so a building is made up of many bricks laid in headers, which are bricks laid the long way, or excuse me, stretchers long way, headers, which are the short way, soldiers, which are up, and many other specialist terms for masonry that I have learned in the past few months and that we will be learning together tonight. But the important part to know is that brick buildings are then the sort of distinct result of two manufacturing processes. There's the act of brick making, and then there is the act of brick laying. And the result is what you see on your screen, a magnificent example of brick architecture here at Cranbrook. This is one of my favorite brick constructions and one of my favorite corners of campus, the entrance into the Cranbrook School dining hall. In this entrance, you can see already our architect Eliel Saarinen working with multiple types of brick, multiple bonds or ways the bricks are stacked to create a pretty dramatic effect. This great solid mass of red common brick made in Detroit, and then this more delicate, almost quilt-like structure of flat wire-cut Roman brick interspersed with limestone. Now, on top of it all is another ceramic clay-based object, tile. What's the difference between tile, brick, and pottery? Well, really, it's just the form that it takes. All of these things are baked clay. Tonight, we are going to see and explore the seemingly limitless variety and endless possibilities of brick at Cranbrook. It's a uniquely brick campus. I think there are more brick buildings here than any campus that I could find as I did my research for comparables, because our architects have really remained dedicated to brick design and brick architecture. Now, I've organized tonight's talk into 3 unequal parts. Part 1 will look at a brief history of brick buildings so that we know the context out of which Cranbrook grows. Next, we'll look at how bricks are made. And I'll try to avoid technical jargon, both because I don't want to embarrass myself, and second, because I want us to all be looking closely together, but we will be learning about bricks and bricklaying and how it's made. And then finally, the bulk of our time will be spent with a study of Cranbrook's bricks. Before we get into the history, I do want to note that this is not a full Cranbrook tour. It's not a full history of Cranbrook. I know some of you will recognize these buildings and where I've taken the photographs. Some of you will not, and that's okay, because we're here for the bricks themselves. And on your next visit to Cranbrook's campus, you can respectfully hunt for these bricks. So, bricks are a very simple concept, and they're some of the oldest things ever discovered. Ancient archaeological digs 12,000 years ago in Jericho found handmade sun-dried bricks. In this Egyptian hieroglyph, you can see at the left of your screen the gathering of water and clay from pools, and then you can see running across the bottom of the hieroglyphs, a brickmaker mixing the clay with mud and straw. Then it's being pushed into an open-bottomed wooden mold on the ground. The top of the mold is then scraped with a wood. The mold is lifted and the bricks are left to dry in the sun. Then eventually they are carried off and being used for some work of architecture. This is the most simple way to make a brick. It's still how they are made along the Nile today. Now, throughout human history, we have used bricks to create things that are much bigger than bricks. And so ancient monuments like the ziggurat here earned their form from millions of humble bricks. And the brick itself was especially respected in Sumerian culture. The word brick, sig in Sumerian, was the same word to use as brick, as building, as city, and also the name of the god of building. And rituals would accompany the first brick to be laid in a project where honey, butter, cream, and tree essences would be mixed together into a sort of mortar or paste on the brick. Now, fast forwarded ancient civilizations to Babylon. Technology was developed to glaze bricks some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Reliefs would be sculpted in wet clay, the bricks dried, a color glaze applied, and then kiln fired. Moving quickly into the classical world, fired brickwork appears during the reign of Julius Caesar in Roman times, and bricks became widespread by the 1st century. Trowels were invented by the Romans, and brick building became a business. Roman soldiers were usually the brick maker, and despite its beauty, these very thin, long bricks, it's a little bit misleading because it's not quite the brick wall you would expect. Roman bricks are in fact large squares. They would look more like a tile to us today. Romans would then cut them down into increasingly smaller squares, or triangles, as illustrated here by Piranesi in the 18th century. And this etching, which is part of George Booth's collection, now in Cranbrook Academy of Art Library, shows a square Roman brick here, and then the Roman brick broken down into triangles, and how those triangles are laid atop a giant concrete mass, and that is what is creating the building. So the brick is essentially holding the concrete. Now, later on in the Roman Empire, brick became exposed, and so it wouldn't actually be covered in marble or render stucco, but brick became celebrated as a material itself. And I just love this relief arch that you see leaping over these 2 doorways at a store in Ostia. Now, by the 5th century, we begin to see thick rectangular bricks laid in the standard process today with header intervals and stretchers as well. We also see the beginning of decorative brick cornices and sawtooth moldings. By medieval Italy, where brick making was centered in the Po Valley, where stone wasn't especially common, you see designers getting really quite wonderfully exuberant with their bricks. And notice here this sawtooth bond at the top projecting out from the molding, and then below that, what is called a corbel table, a series of arches underneath the eave of the roof. Now, the Romans had taken bricks throughout the empire, but brickmaking disappeared for centuries, and it reappears in the 12th century in Northern Europe. And this is important because I believe that these Northern European churches and other brick structures are what inspire Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook. So we look at this church in Denmark with its great brown walls, that corbel going around the cornice, or this magnificent medieval church in Denmark where you have these decorative gables and you see the bricks turned on headers and stretchers and pulled and pushed from the wall surface to create decorative designs across these large gables. And notice the sort of proportion of the gable to the size of the roof. There is this tower, but the tower is the width of the entire building, a design motif that we'll see in sort of certain ways here at Cranbrook, this layering of gables. Or the oldest brick building in modern day Sweden, then Denmark. And I love this little church because of the way that the brick has a great visual interest, even at this distance of us looking at it in a digital photograph on Zoom, but also at a distance from where the camera is to the building. And you see the sort of spotted colors, you see the areas of dark and light, you see the patterning, you see the grain. There's this real beauty to these handmade early medieval bricks. Now, brickmaking would become more standardized in Gothic Italy, leading to better oversight and more regular construction, as well as one of the tallest brick towers ever built, the 330-foot tall tower in Siena. Now, across the peninsula, we see Piazza San Marco with its campanile that perhaps an indictment to brick did fall over in the early 20th century and has since been rebuilt. But you see a composition of brick buildings with marble fronts and then a brick tower with marble ornament. And St. Mark's would really prove to be a sort of planning principle that Eliel Saarinen uses at Cranbrook as he designs all of our many trapezoidal courtyards. Now, in Germany, there was the baked stone Gothic, the Backstein Gothic, and this is in Germany and modern Poland, where it combines this sort of sense of piety and poverty with a display of virtuosity and wealth. And it is that sort of contradiction of a non-Catholic architect creating brick architecture, humble brick, exuberant design. Or the very first brick educational institution, the Old Court at Queen's College, where red brick, which is not made in Cambridge, is laid one row deep over a local clunch, a soft chalk, within a timber interior. But this is the earliest example of a purpose-built, designed college in Cambridge, where all of the sort of acts of passage in a medieval college are under a single building. The residences, the dining hall, the kitchens, the library, the chapel. You can see where I'm going here with our first brick college. Now, by the Enlightenment period, the Low Countries, today Belgium and the Netherlands, were the world's center of brick making and the real sort of center of brick laying. In the Netherlands, there were kilns that could fire 500,000 bricks at once, and Dutch production reached some 200 million bricks a year in the 17th century. They exported bricks throughout Europe and even to the Americas. This castle, Frederiksberg Castle, is in this sort of northern Mannerist style with these fantastic brick and stone gables. Now, in America, The first fired bricks are imported and created by the Spanish and then the Dutch. Of course, there's adobe in America long before that. But skilled bricklayers begin to move to the British colonies as early as Jamestown. Anyone could stack a brick if you had them, but not everyone could make it, and especially the making of mortar was a real skill set. So when Sir Christopher Wren, the London architect, sent over plans for the building of the College of William and Mary, America's oldest school building, he not only sent over the blueprints, he also sent over the bricklayers because he had to bring in the technology and the skills to build the building. And most American colleges were made of brick well into the 19th century, before the fashion to tear down the brick buildings that began looking like mills and rebuilding in stone. The 19th century saw explosive growth in not just population and architectural variety, but also in mechanization. And needless to say, we will not be covering all the brick architectural design innovations of the long 19th century. Instead, the significance is the changes to brick making. Brick making went from a handicraft to a mechanized industry, sort of. In America, where labor was short and technology was well adapted, we began mechanizing our bricks quite early. In Europe, where labor was cheap and plentiful, bricks continued to be handmade until well past World War II. With millions more bricks being made in the 19th century, you start to get railway tunnels, bridges, sewers, factories, houses, offices, museums, churches, all being built of brick. And the mechanization takes place at 3 stages of the manufacturing. The clay preparation, which we see on the top left with a mechanized version of a clay pug, mixing the clay and grinding out impurities. Mechanization also took place in the molding of bricks. And here are 3 sort of brick torture devices that will extrude, press, and mold bricks mechanically. And then mechanization took place in the clay firing. And here you see a new Hoffman-style kiln where the bricks are going to be loaded into empty chambers, and then the fuel and the fire is at the center, and bricks will be loaded into a chamber, and then the fire will be moved to that chamber. Now, what happens as you do that is that if this chamber with my laser is hot, the chamber to the left and the right are going to be warm, and the chambers outside of that are going to be lukewarm. The chambers outside of that are going to be cool. It takes about 100 hours to fire a brick. It's a big lump of clay. And if you start at 1,000 degrees Celsius, your bricks will explode, they will crack, the water will cause impurities. And so the Hoffman kiln was perfect because if your fire is on this side and you're unloading and loading bricks on this side, you are going to be able to use the residual heat of the kiln and be able to make many more bricks than you could with a kiln that you install all the bricks and take them all out, and you're waiting that 100 hours for every single batch. Now, with all of these new bricks came new architecture. In this incredible engraving of London showing brick buildings and brick bridges, Charles Dickens, in his book Bleak House, devotes an entire chapter to the sad life of a London brickmaker's family who lived, as Charles Dickens wrote, in clusters of wretched hovels in a brick field. Industrial produced bricks began to symbolize the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution. John Ruskin said, industrial capitalism feeds the demands of the rows of similar brick houses, which branch in a devouring cancer around every town. William Morris would argue that the modern brick house was simply slavery to commercialism. And so what was the alternative of these mechanically produced brick environments but the handmade brick environment? And here we see Red House, the famed home of William Morris, the sort of spiritual father of the arts and crafts movement and celebrated wallpaper designer. And William Morris and his associates lived here, they worked here, they designed here in this medieval type handmade good brick building. And that's Morris's term, good brick. And Morris said, it's good brick should be, It is a distinct and definite pleasure to see a large blank wall without any ordinary architectural features, if it is really properly built and properly placed together. For William Morris, he said that basically if you build a building and build it entirely out of bricks and all the bricks are handmade and you can get that handmade feel, you will have the sort of fundamental of architecture. This is the root of all good building. Now, this had a very long influence on arts and crafts designers. And so as these arts and crafts designers responded to the Industrial Revolution and celebrated the individual artisan and the individual artist, you get architects like Edwin Landseer Lutyens creating Folly Farm, which is an all brick building with a wooden gable and tile roofs. And this arts and crafts tradition sprung sort of medievalizing brick architecture across Britain and America. Lutyens seconded Morris's plea for a monomaterial construction, writing that a building of one material is for some strange reason much more noble than one of many. It may be the accent it gives of sincerity, the persistence of texture, and the definite unity. And so for Lutyens at Folly Farm, he is using brick and he is creating multiple brick environments. And if you look at these piers, I love the way that he, using pretty regularly shaped bricks, turns them up in order to create these almost bulbous piers that extend the roof line straight into the pond. He's also here incorporating the roofing tiles as brick. Now, the arts and crafts are what inspired Cranbrook's founders, George Goth Booth and Ellen Scripps Booth. George and Ellen lived in the city of Detroit and moved up to the countryside in 1908 into a home designed by the great Detroit architect Albert Kahn in the arts and crafts style. Now, both Kahn and the Booths were members of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, and both promoted this design language of sort of Tudor influences, medieval forms. And you'll see that Cranbrook House has a first floor of brick, a second floor of render, and a third floor of half timbering. So they didn't quite get the mono-material message. But the most misleading thing about Cranbrook House as an arts and crafts showcase is that it is a concrete block home. And that is a real result of Albert Kahn being America's foremost industrial architect. And here you see the legacy of Albert Kahn, what he is famous for, which are these steel reinforced concrete frames that can be filled with brick and glass, as we see here, with all glass, with all brick, with concrete, with wood, with nothing. For Albert Kahn, he was really an engineering architect. And so when it comes to Cranbrook House, he's practicing in a arts and crafts facade, but on a very modern concrete building. Now, if we get closer into the bricks of the 1918 edition, you'll see that they're laid in an English bond where you have one course of stretchers followed by the next course of headers. And so this is allowing the long bricks to become the face. The short bricks are tying the brick back into the building. And also on Cranbrook House, we have happy moments where roofing tiles are used as bricks. Ultimately, though, Cranbrook House is fairly conservative. The arts and crafts movement by the 1920s, when George Booth is expanding the home, was largely coming to an end in Europe, and we were getting into a new era of architecture. Now, in this new era, the 1920s, George and Ellen Booth also set out to expand their private residence, Cranbrook House, and their enormous estate into a series of educational institutions. And as George Booth cuts up paper and envisions building a new school on his property, layering together this collage, he is faced with the dilemma of a new architecture dawning. And there was two choices for Cranbrook's design, sort of in the air of architecture. On the left, tradition, brick and stone, and on the right, high modernist abstraction. And modernist architecture called for mass production with new materials, glass, steel, and concrete. Bricks then present an awkward dilemma for the modernist architect. Bricks are the epitome of mass production, a regular repeated unit produced by the millions from a machine for a very low cost. And yet, bricks are embarrassingly old. In either case, though, this is a terribly deceitful comparison, because the building on the right by Le Corbusier is a brick building covered in plaster, and the building on the left by James Gamble Rogers is a steel and concrete building wrapped in stone and brick. And so modernism sort of hints that brick would decline in the 20th century, and yet more bricks were laid in the 20th century than ever before, and there were terribly exciting developments in brick architecture in the 1920s and 30s as Cranbrook is being envisioned. In America, you see the sort of high point of the colonial revival, beautiful brushed and handmade bricks at the Yale Divinity Quadrangle. But in Europe, you see more adventurous brick constructions, like this church that is almost this sort of organ case way up, with an interior that is brick from the floor to the walls to the ceiling, brick all the way to the pulpit. Even Lutyens is beginning to sort of get engaged in the debate of modernism and traditionalism. And you have these public housing units by Lutyens that are a very curious blend of traditional design and proportion, traditional entrances, with this very modern grid of cast concrete, stone, and brick. Then in the Netherlands, some of the most exciting brick architecture ever produced. Brick on a steel and concrete frame in this style city hall, or brick in the Amsterdam School, like here at the main center sort of stock trading hall. And what's interesting about this building by the famed Amsterdam School architect de Klerk is that it is a concrete frame building. And so his bricks, much like Albert Kahn, are simply a face on a modern concrete structure. What that allows de Klerk to do is run the brick in wildly fantastical patterns, because they are completely detached from their role as structure. Now, de Klerk was a socialist and built social housing in one of the most fantastic neighborhoods in the world. You see this real celebration of the potential of brick, and also a very unique brick carved sculpture. Peter Behrens, who is Tins in Germany, where Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius worked, and where Eliel Saarinen visited, in the interwar period builds a dye work. And it has a pretty fantastic sort of Amsterdam School-inspired exterior. But moving inside to the dye works administration building, you have this sort of hanging textile of colored brick. These are all glazes, just like the Babylonians did, and they are bringing this environment into direct association with the function. You can picture the sort of skeins of wool hanging down, drying from the dye baths. Meanwhile, the bricks, which are in fact stacked up and supporting the roof, but because Behrens pulls them out, the bricks appear themselves to be hanging down in this wonderful rainbow of color. And back to America, where our most innovative brick architecture of the period of the 1920s was in tall building. And here is a sort of casting call of building skyscrapers inspired by Eliel Saarinen's 1922 Chicago Tribune Tower competition, what brought Eliel Saarinen to America. Who ripped him off in brick. And what you may not realize is that even as tall as they are, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building are both brick buildings. But here, the brick is hanging off the edge of a steel frame. So the brick, again, is pure surface. It's waterproofing. It's environmental proofing. But the project that I think most inspired George Booth and Eliel Saarinen in deciding to build Cranbrook in a brick sort of symphony is the Stockholm Town Hall. Eliel Saarinen knew Osberg, the architect. George and Ellen Booth visited the building upon its completion. Many of the artists who worked on this building would eventually work at Cranbrook, and it was probably the most celebrated building of the 1920s. Built of plum-colored brick on Byzantine arches with a curving copper roof, it is anchored by this huge tapering tower. And the production of this was pure arts and crafts, where there were studios for sculpture, painting, iron and copper works, wood carving, weaving, all within the town hall, producing for the town hall. And I love the sort of use of the textured handmade brick to create larger patterns of design within the sort of sheer monumental brick surface. Now, part 2 of our lecture, now that we've gotten some good brick images in our mind, which we can pull forward as we think about Cranbrook, more on how bricks were made. I started off by saying that there are 2 things to understand about a brick. There's a manufacturing process that makes a brick, and then there's a process that lays a brick. And what happened in the US was that the skills for making and laying bricks were in decline because of the Great Depression, because of industrialization and urbanization. And so the federal government steps in and comes up with this bricklaying analysis. And what campus do they use as the high point of American brick architecture but Cranbrook? And so this pamphlet is filled with images of Cranbrook and our bricks. And I'd like to use it tonight as a way of teaching us about brick making. So starting with the image of the steam shovel, digging out the brick earth or the clay and putting the clay into dump cars on a narrow gauge railway. The alternative, if you don't have a steam shovel, is to pick the clay out by hand. Either way, it gets into a gas, electric, or human-powered dump car that then takes the clay to the storage shed. On our left here, we're seeing a sort of handmade old-style pug mill for mixing different kinds of clays or shales and other ingredients with water to create the clay mixture that will be molded into the brick. You will get very different bricks with more water, from soft mud bricks to stiff mud bricks to dry mud. And you have to achieve the right consistency before you try and mold your brick. Now, in this image, you can also see on the far right, a brick maker making 6 bricks at a time in a box mold. This small homemade plant could probably produce about 4,000 green bricks, unfired bricks a day. On the right is a modern brick plant. Here, dry mud is extruded into a long ribbon through the die, and then it is cut by the machine below by rolling wires. And this machine could crank out extruded bricks at a rate of 50,000 to even 100,000 bricks a day, as opposed to 4,000 by our little pug mill and 6-unit casting box. Now, once they are cut or cast, they have to be packed into drying racks. Now, if there are any special shapes, you're going to want them to make them now so that you don't cut the brick. You want to hand press and mold your brick as clay. You do not want to wait until after it has been fired. And this is a process that even today is largely handmade, custom brick shapes. Now, there are 2 ways to dry your brick after it has been cast. First, you can use a drying oven, which is probably the off heat of the kiln. So it's going to be the building next to the kiln using that residual energy. That will dry them faster, but it could also cause cracking depending on your clay content composition. The other alternative is at the bottom of the page, an open air method where wind and water and sun will eventually cause the bricks to dry through evaporation. Now, at this moment, 1940, as well, this would have been true in the 1920s as well. There are basically 2 ways to fire your brick. You can hand stack them in a beehive kiln. That's what's going on here in the left. It takes a whole team to basically individually lift every single brick from the pallet or the cart and stack it into a circular kiln for firing. And where the brick sits is very important because that influences how much oxygen and how much heat is going onto every brick surface. The alternative, the more modern kiln, is to have a continuous or rectangular kiln where the bricks go on a sort of joyride in a stack of 400 on a metal cart, and they spend their 75 to 100 hours rolling through or sitting in a rectangular continuous kiln. Now, when I toured the Kohler continuous kiln in Wisconsin, where they make toilets, they said that these continuous kilns can never be shut down because the heat itself is actually holding the kiln up. And so as soon as you stop firing the kiln would collapse in on itself. Now, this book goes on to tell us much more about bricklaying, as well as the sort of chemistry behind bricks. And you can see here on the top right, the controls that are controlling how much air is entering and exiting the kiln. And in the bottom left, a testing laboratory where clays and glazes are being researched. Back to Cranbrook. In 1923, we have George Booth and Ellen Booth's house sitting on a hill. We have this new era of architecture and brick architecture dawning. They are faced with a choice. How will Cranbrook develop? Will we be a modern campus? Will we be a revival or traditional campus? And what will we be made of? Now, by 1950, when George and Ellen have passed away, those decisions have become quite clear. We are an educational community made up of 6 institutions, and we are threading that needle between tradition, like you see in the Meeting House and Christchurch Cranbrook, and modernity, like you see at the Art Museum and Institute of Science. And then the most interesting is where the line becomes blurred between tradition and modernity. And all of the institutions, Brookside School, a K through 12 school for children, Christchurch Cranbrook, an Episcopal church, Cranbrook School for Boys, an upper boarding school, Kingswood School for Girls, the Cranbrook Institute of Science, and Cranbrook Academy of Art with its library and museum. All of these institutions are built in brick. You look at the church, it is stone, but let's look inside the church, and it is a brick structure. So brick here is playing its most common role, which is as a backing to a more refined, more expensive, and considered to be more aesthetically pleasing finished stone. And so you see George Booth standing in the St. Dunstan's Chapel at Christchurch Cranbrook, and behind him you see a stonemason, totally separate profession, who is building up a stone wall that the brick mason has already created the inside of. And so Christchurch is basically 2 walls of stone with a very thick wall of brick in the middle. Now, as we begin part 3, a close looking of Cranbrook's brick architecture, I want to begin with Thornley. And not many a Cranbrook history begin here, but there's a very important reason why. Thornley is the home of George and Ellen Booth's youngest son, Henry Scripps Booth. He studied architecture at the University of Michigan under Eliel Saarinen. He was best friends with J. Robert F. Swanson, his classmate and then business partner. And here at Thornley, the house that Henry built for his wife Carolyn and their growing family, the building is built out of a combination of clay tile roof, Dutch brick, and concrete walls. We see this interesting diagonal pattern of bricks, what we call a diaper pattern, going up the side of the house. I say interesting because it is on a standard English bond. You'll notice that the bricks inside the diaper, there are no headers. Every brick is a stretcher. It's the long way. Traditionally, in medieval architecture, a diaper pattern actually occurs because of the stretchers, and it's integrated into the way the bricks are laid up and bonded. It's the kind of thing that makes me wonder, is this intentional or is it a 20-something-year-old building his first building? Either way, lovely diaper patterning. On the side of the house, we have structural brick arches. Here you can see that Henry is using a standard size brick with a larger mortar joint. The alternative to achieve a brick arch is to use a trapezoidal shaped brick. So you either use a rectangular brick with trapezoidal mortar, which you see here, or you could have used a custom made trapezoidal brick. Now, why did he not use a trapezoidal brick? Because all of these bricks are imported from the Netherlands. And I'm not sure that he was custom ordering mold shapes as he orders some 100,000 Dutch bricks. You'll see the way that he weaves together the brick at the corner and on the window frames with concrete block that was, I presume, made locally. But it is just really crazy to think about the expense, the dedication, and I'm still not sure the result of ordering brick from the Anglo-Dutch Trading Corporation. This organization brought bricks from the Netherlands into America. Here you can see that Henry Booth and J. Robert F. Swanson, architectural partners, have ordered a barrel of brick to use as a sample. Satisfied with their sample barrel of brick, they then order their first set of 17,000 Holland-faced bricks, which are shipped over the Pennsylvania Railroad to Birmingham, where they are then picked up by W.P. Smith, contractor, and delivered by the Hoe Tower Company hauling contractor, the subcontractor, who would pick up eventually 192,000 Dutch bricks that have traveled across the Atlantic, across half the continent, and ended up building 3 buildings: Thornley Tower Knoll, the home of J. Robert F. Swanson and Pipson Sarnan Swanson, as well as the Academy Administration Building. This building was not designed by Sarnan. Sarnan was an advisor on the project, and it was designed by the young architects Bob and Henry. They used the Anglo-Dutch Brick Company bricks to create this really beautiful pattern. It's a really sort of multicolored, textured brick. It does have enormous sort of old world charm. Now, looking down from the window at the paver, for many years I've walked over these and assumed that they are tiles. The more I thought about bricks, though, I realized that in fact these are full bricks, and so these are square, flat Roman brick. Now, I went out and measured, and these are not dimensioned to any of our known sort of sesquus, pedipus, other fun Roman brick terms, but it is that Roman style brick of a large square that we saw Piranesi illustrating. And on the side of the building, a great moment of sort of levity in the architecture, a crane. Cranbrook is Old English for where the crane lands. And so you have on the building this beautiful rendering of a crane landing in a little body of water. Now, this was featured in that 1940 Guide to Bricklaying, where the author of that little pamphlet points out the fact that a bricklayer doing a design is not actually asking the brick to do any work, but asking the mortar to do the work. And this is important because that is a much more difficult task. By using regular shaped bricks, your eye is perceiving this circle wholly through the mortar. You're not actually looking at the individual component bricks, you're looking at the negative space, and that requires an extremely skilled mason, the kind of mason that our contractor Charles Vermuth would have been hiring because Vermuth was the best in the business. Now, notice the field within the circle is a continuous brick course from the side of the building. And so it runs straight across the design, and that further adds to the sort of cohesive beauty of this piece. It feels quite integrated into the building. It could easily have sort of collapsed and looked sort of amateurish if not for the quality of brick mason. Now, the little crane is landing in water, which are in fact broken terracotta drain pipes turned on edge and used as bricks. His tail feathers are roofing tiles used as brick. And then what must have been a fun hunt for Henry and Bob, going through all of those 190,000 bricks and looking for one that had presumably a mistake of a single little circle used as the eye of the crane. Now, within this building, what is now the Departments of Photography and Print Media at the Academy of Art was originally the Cranbrook Architectural Office. Professor Geza Marotti, a Hungarian sculptor and architect, worked upstairs doing our architectural ornament, and downstairs, Professor Eliel Saarinen worked on the design of Cranbrook. And they would have looked out onto a terracotta Etruscan jar. Inside of the room, next to a fabulous briquette fireplace, were the models of Cranbrook, constructed by Loya Saarinen, wife of Eliel Saarinen, these displayed the transformation of the farmland into the Cranbrook community. Now, here we see Eliel sitting next to the model with Marotti upstairs in his studio. And these are the sort of thinkers, the brain trust that is creating this unique campus behind. First up is the Cranbrook School for Boys. Like all of the brick buildings from Saarinen's hand, these are load-bearing masonry brick walls supporting one-way concrete rib slabs. This is a fireproof system of construction. It's also unusual. By load-bearing brick masonry, I mean that these brick walls are thick, that there are multiple bricks back, instead of what would have been cheaper and more common, which would have been a front brick and then a clay tile, a concrete block, or some other substructure behind it. Saarinen chooses to build all true brick buildings. And I love that even late in the day, in the construction of the building, there are still little piles of brick sitting outside of this magnificent brick building. And the press that comes to visit, I love the author of that story I showed a moment ago, who wrote that we see the actual evolution of an idea taking substantial form in building between studio and campus. It's a unique and charming design. And I think that this sort of ambiguity of the style is reflected in lines like, "The building has no period, but is designed with such perfect harmony for its purpose and setting." And the author continues, "It dawned upon us that we were witnessing something new in American architecture." And remember how I framed the decision of George and modernism. And what they get is the middle way. Something new, something old, something familiar, something wholly original. All of it constructed in Detroit-made common bond red brick. And the Detroit Brick Manufacturer and Dealers Association was started by a group of Detroit brick makers in order to industrialize and professionalize the Detroit brick-making community of some half dozen to a dozen brick yards. Bricks were mostly based in Springwell, a neighborhood on the west side of Detroit, and it was really dominated by the Clippert Brick Company, though I'm not sure which member of the Detroit Brick Manufacturer and Dealer Association made our common brick. Now, common brick is an unusual choice to use as the face of these buildings because it is a brick that is very soft and it is not meant to be a finished product. It also has high levels of irregularity and it is just generally not considered to be a beautiful brick. But the brick company says the whole building is made of common brick. We look closer and we realize, nope, here again, we see Eliel Saarinen using roofing tiles as brick, now in a very ornamental sort of frieze between two levels of the main classroom building. And I love this curious example of architectural ornament, where you have an actual brick arch here holding the weight of the building above. And then you have, I mean, these are 8 inches deep tile. They are holding up the next floor, but it is a series of tiny arches. So in a campus that is full of load-bearing brick arches, you then have this almost model of the building of these little repeating brick arches made out of tiles. Now, I want to point out this door. Geza Marotti sculpted and designed a larger display that was never completed. He would eventually sculpt the crane, which is now at Brookside School. But what I find most intriguing is this sketch on the brick. And was Marotti proposing that in this column here, that it would be carved into the brick a sort of friendly looking crane who to my eye seems to be inviting us in with his wing. He also seems to be wearing glasses. It would have been a comical and intriguing example of carved brick sculpture on the building. Now inside there is in the tower a sort of amazing octagonal brick arch that is springing from a central concrete post. And this is load bearing. It is carrying the weight of the tower, but it is also sort of pure structural acrobatics. This is Saarinen having fun with his bricks. Across the courtyard, the dormitories were constructed at the same time, 1927. And you see this sort of great wall of brick. And as George Booth was attempting to save money on this very expensive enterprise, he asked engineers to tell him how much it would be to not build a solid brick wall. And they said, you would save a lot of money. For whatever reason, the conversation stopped there. And this is, again, a solid masonry wall. There is no clay tile or hollow tile behind it. What I think is quite interesting is that these load-bearing arches that are allowing the windows to open, you'll see that this window is arched, but this one is flat. And this is expressing the progressive weight of the building, where here, this steel lintel is holding the bricks and roof, but then where you have this window that is spanning the entire weight of the floor above it. Remember, the concrete is resting on these bricks. You have to have this arch to actually support the weight above it. And then the floor below is also arched because the weight is coming down. It was Louis Kahn who said that the weight of a brick makes it dance like a fairy above and groan below. And you see the sort of expression of the weight of the building through these arched or non-arched window patterns. Now, the dining hall was finished in 1928, a year later, and here we see a more principal room using a more traditionally luxurious material, limestone. And so you have arched limestone windows that are then complemented by these funny blind arched brick windows. And I don't know what these mean, but I think they tell us a story. They tell us, oh, maybe this building is ancient. Maybe this building had another life. Maybe something happened to this building to cause these little imperfections. Now, I closely studied the photograph showing the scaffolding around this building, and there are no moments where the scaffolding was going into the brick wall and then Saarinen covered it up using a blind brick window. In fact, looking at the blueprints, I can tell that every single one of these instances of pushed brick or blind windows were drafted in advance by the architect, and they are part of the design aesthetic of the building. Now, around the base of the roof, you have a series of arches created out of a mixture of tile and Roman brick. And notice how he is turning the tiles and bricks in different directions. So you have them going straight up here to a sort of square arch, or here you have the tiles forming a perfect arch. Here you have the same arch without the centering. So again, endless variety across the building. And it is a sort of callback to the Scandinavian religious architecture of the medieval period. The arts and crafts were about a sort of guild and medieval revival, the revival of handcraft. And so the architect is looking back towards his own native Scandinavia and its medieval architecture with the corbel table below the roofline. Now, the arches continue on features like the chimney, where you see the course of bricks laid in a straight stretcher pattern going up to little arches. And as we follow that up, you'll see that you have 3 arches, and then 5 arches. So as the chimney is telescoping smaller towards the heavens, the sort of frenetic energy of the arches increases as it goes up. Or this perplexing gable, where you have perplexing to I think the sort of modernist viewer, an example of exposed concrete construction. And what do the modernists love but exposed concrete? Think of the Bauhaus. And yet Saarinen is simply using his exposed concrete as a lintel on which to build a Roman brick arched gable. And so you have this sort of contradiction of a very modern expression of a material and a very traditional sort of graphic or ornament system on top of it. And I love the interplay as you walk through the quadrangle of the gables interacting and sort of looking and creating layers between space and framed views. As we look at the end of the dining hall, notice it has these tumbled-in gable ends, where these are Roman bricks coming down in a diamond pattern. And I think he's looking towards perhaps his own sort of Finnish medieval architecture, where you have here a gable end of turned and ornamented brick patterns. But of course, at Cranbrook, ours is infused with the Art Deco, and it is this blend, again, of modernity and tradition. And then there are the inexplicable moments, like my favorite feature, the dining hall doorway, where in architecture history is this coming from? What is Eliel Saarinen looking at? I am not sure. It is a strange and wonderful sort of quilt of limestone and Roman brick. It has enormous variety across this system, where you'll see that the bottom row is blind and each features a strange sort of stone vase. Each of the limestone panels has a different sort of fenestration or leaded glass system. Some even become carved as if they are dandelions. And then you have the sort of grid of Roman brick and limestone all offset in front of the common brick walls. Now, we have seen a strange brick and grid environment yet today, but this is after Saarinen has already completed his entrance in 1928. So I'm not sure where these architects are looking, but to me it seems to be textiles. It is this idea that you can quilt with material other than fabric. And I love this photograph taken by our student photographer, Trist, who took many of the photographs we see today, where it is comparing this more conventional left-hand gable with bay window, and then this really unusual and original entrance on the right. And what I think is Saarinen's great success in the entire Cranbrook campus is the ability to seamlessly weave together the familiar and the unusual. He sort of creates something exciting, but he's not making us be threatened by the architecture. That would go against the sort of mission of the institution. Now, turning around from the dining hall, we see Page Hall on the left, the last building of this group, 1930. And we see here a herringbone pattern of Roman brick going up and down in exciting diagonals above this series of carved limestone sculptures designed by Eero Saarinen, who would have been 19 when he designed these for his father. And then you see the little brick arches here, which are jumping off of these cut bricks and then surrounded by what are called creepers. Those are the straight bricks that surround an arch. And then what actually launches the sort of herringbone system are these diamond-shaped bricks. So perhaps on our tour, I'll give everyone a measuring tape and we'll measure how many brick shapes there are out there. I have a list, and every time I think I'm done, I find 2 more new shapes of a brick that all had to be custom made and custom cast and a custom mold built. Looking at the side of Page Hall, there are these bricks that are pushing and pulling, and these are vitrified bricks, clinkers. The name clinker comes from the sound that it makes inside of the kiln when this happens. And what exactly has happened? The brick has gotten too hot, too close to the flame, and it has vitrified. It has gone from a solid into a glass. It has liquefied, essentially. And so these clinkers explode. They are then thrown away. And then architects of the Craftsman period, particularly Green in Pasadena, begin to buy up these waste clinkers and build them into buildings. And here you see Eliel Saarinen getting in on the clinker game, where this half-exploded, overheated brick is used as a standard brick within the wall. Now, looking down towards the dormitory through the baldachin, with the ironwork by Saarinen and made at Cranbrook, we see this dark portal. But as we get closer to that dark door, we see that it is in fact this sort of arched brick opening. And when I see this brickwork, I'm reminded of the sort of medieval Italian brickwork and the exuberance of a sort of pale brick turned different directions. And as the sunlight streams across it, you get all the texture from the mortar and the brick shapes and the turning of the different designs. Next door on this building is something completely different, where here you have a more sort of geometric composition, and you have the common brick that is tapering back, and then you have a Roman brick that is laid in a straight bond. So instead of laying them in a sort of English bond overlapping, you have these continuous mortar lines that zip to the bottom and then cut across. And so you end up with, again, a composition that is more like a textile than a brick wall. Now, there are moments where you end up with a completely different aspect. So instead of that sort of precision of brick making and laying, here you have a real sort of whimsy where Saarinen has integrated the walls that George Booth built out of limestone, or out of granite, in about 1906. George Booth took all of these granite rocks. He had his masons split them in two and build the walls of Cranbrook. All of these rocks are from the property, are from the farming of the property. What Eliel Saarinen did was his buildings began to butt up against these walls. He would dismantle them and then rebuild them and transition from stone wall into brick building. And so when you drive along the edge of campus across Lone Pine Road, you see this really sort of watercolor-like transition of stone and brick. And this reminds me of the sort of painterly aspects to Eliel Saarinen's work, who, as a student, had studied both painting, the process of a warm heart, and architecture, the logic of a cool mind. Those are his terms. And here I think we see the architect with a sort of warm heart, blending together these two materials. And it's a very different architectural language he'll use in his first buildings for Cranbrook Academy of Art. Here, the Arts Club of 1930. And I just want to quickly compare the bricks of Cranbrook School for Boys on the left, Detroit Common Brick, and the brick that we will see for the rest of campus, what I believe to be Wyandotte brick from Upper Sandusky, Ohio. And you can tell that they are two different effects. The one on the left is most likely slop molded. It's a wetter clay. It's a softer brick. The one on the right is pallet molded with sand. And so here is a pallet mold of the type used to make our brick. And you can see that there's sand inside of this mold. You stuff the clay in, and then you flip the brick out, and the sand acts as a release. The sand stays on the brick, and it allows the bricks not to fuse together in the kiln. This brick that I keep lifting is getting sand all across my desk, stopping my mouse from working. And so the sand becomes both a practical aspect of mold making, of firing, and then it also leaves this beautiful textured effect on the brick. Now, our sand molded bricks were likely cast in beehive kilns. Not likely, they were. That's sort of the only result. And how do I know that? I can tell because they were hand stacked in the kiln. And so if we look at our bricks on the right, do you see here, there is a chip in the brick. And this chip is showing a much more red clay. And our bricks were made of red clay. And then in an oxidant reduction, the bricks were turned brown in the kiln. By reducing the amount of oxygen or increasing the oxygen, you can change the color of a brick. By changing the heat or the duration of time in the kiln, you can change the color of the brick. And so as we look at these two bricks, the colors are coming from atmospheric conditions. And as you reduce the oxygen, you're going to cause the iron to form oxides such as magnetite or ferrous oxide and turn the brick brown, then black, and then blue. Now, how else do I know that our bricks were done in beehive kiln? Do you see this dark spot here? This would have been a brick stacked on top of the brick I am showing you. And so the brick would have been vertically placed in the kiln, and they would have crossed each other. And that dark spot is where our brick had a different temperature, a different relationship to the atmospheric condition, and therefore had a different color. Now, what else can we see different about these two walls? Look at the mortar. The bed joints, the horizontal, as well as the perpins, the vertical mortars, are very different. The arts and crafts buildings, the academy buildings, are made of bricksmint, which is a cement-based mortar instead of a lime-based mortar. It is much harder. It is much more durable. It is much cheaper to use because it stays liquid longer, so you can mix a larger bat and use it for a longer course of brick. It also, intriguingly, as Charles Vermuth is suggesting to Eliel Saarinen to use this mortar, Vermuth makes an interesting note that I could find no more information about. He says, this will provide a color for a joint that is more nearly the color which Mr. Saarinen would like to have had obtained at the boys' school and which we obtained by painting, which does imply that they painted the mortar at the boys' school. Either way, that at the boys' school is a lime mortar. Here we have a cement mortar. And then here is the actual construction of the brick and mortar. And notice this regular geometry of vertical piers and horizontal brick. It is much more rectangular than the arched architecture of the boys' school. And look closely and you'll see that the vertical elements, the piers, the engaged pilasters, as well as the columns and these niches are all made of a very flat brick. And then the body of the building, the actual walls, are made out of the standard size brick. And so he is repeating this sort of rhythm across the facade of large brick wall, narrow brick intervention, back and forth, and creating a sort of larger pattern within the already richly patterned architecture. Now, if we look up at the top, we see these funny little column capitals made by pushing and pulling bricks in. You'll also see that the lintel is now made up of a soldier course of bricks running up and down and supported on a steel plate, no longer the sort of brick arch. And then if we look even past this feature into the chimney, you'll see that the chimney at the boys' school was made up of little arches. The chimney of the art school is made up of little rectangles, reflecting that rectangular entrance. And even within the wall, there are moments where Eliel Saarinen quite subtly shifts from using simply 2 rows of standard brick, and he replaces them with 4 rows of Roman brick. Again, something for the eye to catch onto, for you to learn and explore. Now, lest you be feared that we don't have any roofing tiles as brick, look up in the corner of most of the Art Academy buildings and you will see that Saarinen either uses Roman brick or roofing tiles to solve the problem of how do you get these soldiers, these vertical bricks, to turn a corner. And so he does it by using the ceiling tiles. There are also other moments of whimsy, like this limestone chicken on the fireplace on the chimney stack of Studio Eliel Saarinen. And I love the way that the sculpture, likely designed by Eliel Saarinen, is then surrounded by Roman brick in this sort of halo. Now, looking at the arts and crafts courtyard from Lone Pine Road, we see this very sort of William Morris approved brick building. It is a very brick building. It is sort of mono material from the studios to the showroom to the office, from the garden wall. It is all about this sort of brick construction. And the sort of endless variety of gables around the campus. Here we have one that is made up of Roman brick and the sand-cast Wyandotte brick. And what's interesting is in the morning light, when I'm sort of headed out of my house and heading to the little parking lot, you look down Lone Pine Road and you see that the Roman brick is reflecting light in a very different way than the sand-cast brick is absorbing light. And this is a direct result of the 2 brick manufacturing techniques. The Wyandotte brick is made with that sand cast. It has a very flat appearance. The Roman brick is wire cut. So it's been extruded, and that sharp wire against the sharp clay is simply creating what is imperceivable in most light that becomes visible in the morning or evening sun. And within this room, Eliel Saarinen worked with a team of Swedish weavers on a commercial weaving enterprise. You see Loya standing here with Maya Anderson Vida, her shop supervisor, and they produced textiles for Cranbrook's buildings and beyond. And here you have Cranbrook Rug number 1, a wall hanging depicting a tree of life. And look closely. What do you see in the tree of life but a grid of squares stacking up to a pyramid with squares in the center? And then look at the gable and you see a grid of squares with squares in the center. Interestingly, the hanging is older than the building by about 6 months. And then also on the hanging, we have on the upper left, a mason, very appropriate for a brick talk, to bring in the woven or hand-knotted mason on this raya rug. And then on the other side, we have a little gabled building. And these can be seen to represent art and architecture, the sort of 2 focuses of the Cranbrook enterprise, getting its start here in 1928. Now, next, I want us to look at this little stairway that's popping out of the arts and crafts courtyard. And if we look at the corner of the stairway, you see how the bricks are having to meet at this irregular angle? Okay, so Cranbrook's bricks are great at blocking internet. And we're back. And so basically, if you try and crack a brick with a mason's hammer, you will end up with this unusual sort of raw edge, the clay body coming out. So the alternative is to simply build with bricks and build designs that are kind of unitized to the brick itself. And so I think the magnum opus of brick engineering at Cranbrook is the basket woven brick barrel vault at the Arts and Crafts Studio, where you see Saarinen creating a problem, which is how do you build a load-bearing masonry brick vault that is smaller at one end and larger at the other. And so he does this, and it's pretty imperceptible in the photograph. He does this by laying the bricks in this diagonal basket pattern. And in order to create a vault that is smaller at one end and larger at the other, which you really just have to experience this in person, he either could have used bricks that got increasingly smaller, but that would have been a lot of brick molding and brick shaping, or he lays them on this sort of diamond pattern. And I'm reminded of a famous quote from the great architect Louis Kahn, a generation younger than Eliel Saarinen. Louis Kahn was the son of a bricklayer. He was, in his own word, a practitioner of the religion of brickwork. And Louis Kahn, in a lecture in 1961 at the University of Pennsylvania, told his audience about an imaginary conversation with bricks that he had had. And so Louis Kahn, you say to a brick, "What do you want, brick?" And the brick says to you, "I like an arch." And you say to brick, "Look, I want one too, but arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel." And then you say, "What do you think of that, brick?" And the brick says, "I like an arch." And so for Kahn, it was that sort of, this is the unit, and the unit is telling you what it wants to be. And a brick wants to span space by being an arch. A brick is a sort of individual object, kind of useless, maybe sort of small household uses, doorstops, but really the brick wants to spring forth and be an arch. Now, as we move down Academy Way, we are progressing along in time and progressing into more brick buildings of Sarnan's design. And when you look at Sarnan House, which was built to be the president's residence, it's this very simple facade, very simple volume of space. And its beauty comes from both the way the bricks are staggered, the way the bricks are turned, headers and stretched. And Loya Saarinen provides this open weave curtain in a Finnish folk style. And you have this sort of interconnected nature between the architecture, the window, and the textile, the curtain. And when we head outside of the building, do you see how the vertical casement window continues on in the brick, where you have dark headers providing the same sort of rhythm as the dark windows? And then on the front of the house, I love these small windows leading into the pantry or the coat room and bathroom, which seem to be surrounded almost by brick curtains, where by running the bricks in this standard or stacked course, Saarinen is able to create mortar lines that really read as if it is a textile flanking these windows. Across the street, he does a similar thing where in a blind window, he again uses broken terracotta drain pipes, and he creates almost a stained glass brick design, where instead of just a blind filled in window, very popular in the arts and crafts movement, he creates this decorative blind window that begins to replicate the stained glass windows of his own home. And so here in the cozy corner, the sort of family room, you see the bench raya of hand-woven textiles by Eliel Saarinen, leading up towards this gorgeous piece of stained glass that's stained blue and green. And then we look next door and you see that the brickwork mirrors this same window. So you have in the house a grid of 4x3 glass triangles, and you have above the door a grid of 4x3 brick triangles. Stepping further into the house, and we see the exhibition rug, which is very geometric, but also masonry-like. And so you see the way that the pathways of the boys' school in stone and brick are then repeated in the design of the hand-knotted rug. So it's the similar design language across different materials, stone, brick, and wool. Now, our next site is Kingswood, and we see here the model created by Eliel Saarinen. And this model is easy enough to build in wood and plaster, much more difficult to build in brick. And off to the get-go, Cranbrook was a little bit perplexed because the Wyandotte Company writes to Eliel Saarinen, or rather to the architecture department, that the bricks were expected to be at Cranbrook with new bricks for Kingswood. However, the burners got the kiln too hot and they were overburned, delayed a week. And so you see here that then they sign off, trusting the delay will not inconvenience you. And if you have a little rabbit in a brick as your letterhead, I don't know how you could be inconvenienced, but you do see the sort of struggle between the kiln and the kind of difficulties of making brick to the realities of a building schedule and construction. Now, when we look across the building, it is all brick with a copper roof, and it is deeply indebted to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so here we see Frank Lloyd Wright and Eliel Saarinen coming down the steps of Kingswood School in April 1935. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright would say that a brick is simply a small, worthless, and ordinary thing that costs 11 cents. But give Frank Lloyd Wright a brick and it becomes worth its weight in gold. And we can see here on the left how Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago at the Roby House did turn brick into gold with his famous prairie-style houses, low-slung buildings, low to the earth with hipped roofs. Kingswood obviously indebted to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, but from the hand of Eliel Saarinen. Now, Architectural Forum says that the exterior of this building has no effort to achieve a startlingly different or individualistic scheme of architectural design. And this fact may account largely for the undoubted success of the building. Kingswood shows that brick may still be used with imagination and taste to perform an effect that is unusually yet entirely straightforward and unforced. So even the architectural critics are saying, you know, we're in a world where you can be modern or tradition. Kingswood is threading that line. You step inside, you see the thickness of the brick walls create this beautiful poche, or the thickness at the window, and this wall of glass acting like a tapestry, a precursor to the dining hall, where the tapestry, the Festival of the May Queen, hangs. Now, throughout the building, architecture and tapestry will sort of flip-flop. And so you go from the dining hall, where it's a tapestry of wood, into the stairway, where up a handmade porcelain or a Pewabic pottery tile stairway, you go past a sort of tapestry of glass. And on the outside, you see that the openings with the glass windows are expressed through lead and glass. The openings that are backed by Pewabic tiles are still expressed with a similar design in brick. You get to the top of the stairs and you come to another bench raya sitting area where, again, hand-woven textiles from Studio Eliel Saarinen feature the same design as the window. It's a grid of squares with black triangles in both cases. And outside the school, at the entrance, you have this wall where I see it as a sort of bench raya. You have bricks turned different directions, pushed different depths in and out of the wall. And then it sort of rolls down across the Mankato Kasota limestone bench. And I'm reminded of Peter Behrens and his sort of textilian architecture and the way that the units of the brick and the fact that a brick works on a grid and a loom works on a grid can result in these direct similarities. And so stick with me here. Because weaving at Cranbrook is the sort of craft. It's the mothercraft of the whole creative enterprise. But at Cranbrook School on the right, it's not so much weaving architecture as quilting. It's a sort of solid brick surface holding ornament versus this subtle transition that happens in Saarinen's architecture, where the brick begins to be treated as tapestry itself. And so it is a transition from I would say, quilting together the building, setting things into and apart from the brick wall, into allowing the brick wall to be the textile, to be the structure, to be the ornament. It becomes much more integrated, much more enmeshed. At the same time, you have these instances where around the door jamb then reflects a hand-woven textile on the inside. So here we're seeing three figures of Y-shaped forms, a Y-shaped textile by Eliel Saarinen with peacocks, Y-shaped leaded glass windows, and then Y-shaped masonry. And all of the masonry at Kingswood, it is still load-bearing, it is still holding weight, but it is no longer constructed through a system of arches. Instead, it is steel lintels. And so the entire sort of engineering of Kingswood becomes this tightly interconnected, dare I say, interwoven mixture of bearing brick walls, concrete vaults and slabs, stone columns, and steel trusses. It's all out of necessity built at the same time, which is quite difficult because at this date, 1931, contemporary builders would have wanted to build a concrete building and then wrap it in brick. They would not want to weave together the brick and the concrete to create this unit. And so when you look at the overall effect, it is one of extreme beauty. But who ever heard of a brick with a sense of humor? That is the advertisement that Wyandotte Clay Products Company asked in Architectural Forum, January 1932. As the copywriter, who was, I'll say it, not paid enough, writes, "Why, these bricks actually have personality," exclaimed an architect as he stood off to look at a Wyandotte brick wall. "Yes, we confess to an individuality in our brick that amounts to a real personality, and it is a brick with a sense of humor too." They continue, "There are many good bricks in the world. We do not claim ours to be better than any other, but we do claim a distinctive quality that identifies Wyandotte brick, though it be found in the furthermost corner of the world, a downy, suede, light texture, and a rare diadem of colors." I mean, that is a great ad, and it does express the beauty and the diadem of colors found at Kingswood. Now, this humorous brick is not only the unglazed sandcast brick, but also green glazed brick. And so you have these really monumental corner bricks that are shedding water in two directions, a very unusual shape, all of it glazed with a green that matches the copper once it patinates of the roof of the building. And I just want to point out here the way that the brick runs directly into the window. And so do you see how these header course of bricks then form the exact same dimension of the leaded glass? Again, the idea that you can weave straight across materials. And this comes into sort of depth of field because Saarinen begins to sort of do stack bonds where the bricks are just running in lines up and down the building, or here at the chimney stack, which features a horizontal, vertical, and diagonal pattern as the chimney telescopes towards the sky. And this appearance would be really terrible if it was in a craftsman less than those building Kingswood, because these geometries, these straight lines, are really demanding of the mason. And Kingswood in particular was built by Norwegian masons, who I didn't know Norway was known for its bricks, but may this be a testament to the Norwegian masons. Now, the other side of that chimney stack is the original study hall, where there are two rugs designed by Maya Anderson Vieda under Studio Eliel Saarinen. The first is the Rooftops Rug. There are two of these that are on display, the red Ludovici tiles of the Cranbrook Boys' School in textile. Then in the center of the room was an enormous rug that has this sort of architectural subdivision, architectural ornament, but is depicting the Cranbrook institutions. And so you see here on the right, the Arts and Crafts Court, and this is the room where this rug was hand knotted by the Swedish weavers. And then here on the rug is where that same scene depicted in wool. Now, you get to the art museum and we get to a building that I think many of us would read as stone, but is still a fundamentally brick building. And we look at the construction and you can see it is again this sort of integration of different skills where you have the stone being lifted by crane. And then up here, our lonely mason who is laying the bricks between two stone piers. But this building, the best documented construction project at Cranbrook, shows us, if we zoom in, just how much it takes to build a solid brick wall like this. Notice there are 4 or 5 masons in this photograph. Then there are the people who are handing the mortar on mortar boards to the masons. This gentleman is mixing the mortar in a barrel. This gentleman might be lifting the bricks. And who knows if these people are assisting in the process. So it really is a team effort to go up and build a building in these 2-inch increments. Now, in front of the art museum, underneath the stairs is another brick wall, and this is a more standard use of common brick. And even in a black and white photo, you can tell that this brick and this brick are not the same. Here are our humorous Wyandotte buckskins, and here is probably a Detroit common brick that will eventually be covered in the limestone steps. This brick would be built really without any questions asked. The Wyandotte buckskins, though, these have had little samples built in front of the museum for Eliel Saarinen to come by and approve the design and masonry before they build the entire building. Now, the inside of these buildings are also brick, common brick that is then coated with plaster and wood paneling to create an interior finish. And the outside, again, we probably think of it as a stone building because of the limestone peristyle, but it is fundamentally a very fast and very beautiful brick building. And you have this gorgeous coloration of the Wyandotte buckskin bricks, which really do come in a diadem of colors. And so you have the regularity of the Mankato stone, which has this sort of even golden tone. And then there is the irregularity, almost like a mosaic of the brick complementing the two together. Now, the budget is, this could have been a stone building. And so it is a conscious choice to build in this composition between stone and brick. And when we look at the integration of sculpture as well as sculptural pedestals, as well as architectural ornament in the form of these odd sort of bulges and lines, these strange runes around the building, you begin to see layering onto the stone, onto the brick, art and architectural ornament in a manner consistent with the best work of Studio Eliel Saarinen, like this tapestry, the Cranbrook map, where you see the Cranbrook campus as envisioned, as unbuilt, woven in Wyandotte buckskin colored threads for the buildings of the academy here, copper roofs, red clay tile roofs of the Cranbrook Boys' School, the girls' school here, the Institute of Science. But look beyond the map and the sort of genius of the map, and do you see these subdivisions? Perhaps those are landscape features, but I would see them almost as masonry or as brick. And so the textile itself is beginning to repeat this tapestry-like effect that you get with the brick by the use of different colored yarns. Now, I realize we are over time, but we had the internet issue, so I beg your forgiveness and stick with me as we move into the Cranbrook's newer architecture. And I show here, compare and contrast, a 1942 brick wall at Cranbrook Art Museum and a 2002 brick wall at Cranbrook Academy of Arts New Studios. Designed by Rafael Beneo, these buildings are brick, and just like the original museum buildings, which had the demonstration brick in front, the new studios also had a demonstration of Endicott's number 77 iron spot Solomon grind brick. Unlike the art museum and every Eliel Saarinen building, though, the new studios does exist as a concrete and steel building. And the brick then is simply a facade. And it is a modern facade that uses metal tiebacks to connect the brick over a layer of styrofoam for insulation, over a layer of vapor and moisture barriers, and back to the concrete structure of the building. So what you have is a brick wall that is only supporting the brick above it, nothing else. And because it is integrated into this less pleasant sort of tapestry of materials, you end up needing things like control joints. And so these are silicone joints that allow the building to shift as all of these materials move in heat and humidity at different rates, and the building not to crack. You also have to get the water out of that cavity somehow, and so you have drip lines and other openings in the masonry, all of which gives the building's masonry a little bit of a synthetic feel relative to this gorgeous structural brick wall behind it. Now, over at Brookside School, what look like two non-brick buildings, both in fact use, I think, pretty sophisticated and pretty ancient ways of incorporating brick. On the right, Henry Booth's 1937 incorporates this dog tooth or hound's tooth or mouse tooth corbel line, this early as the Roman times. And so Henry has done a brick course here, a diagonal brick course here, a brick course above, and that is what is popping off of his building. Intriguingly, his whole building is brick and it's covered with stucco. Now, Peter Rose, the Cambridge-based and Montreal-based architect, is building a concrete block building, but where the concrete block meets a need to be a half concrete block, he switches to brick. So do you see where the windows, the concrete block is here? Now this could be a half concrete block, but that goes against the sort of idea of a concrete block. So instead he runs bricks. Or here, where the concrete block and the cast concrete lintel meet, again, bricks. And so if we look more closely at this detail, you'll see that the building is exploiting the fact that all of these are unit measures. And so you have one brick going back, one brick going across, and those are units of the concrete block. His own home, Thornley, next door. Now, we look across the Eliel Saarinen brick quadrangle towards our next great brick, the Cranbrook Natatorium. This building, designed by Tom. I apologize, everyone. I apologize, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're just finishing up with our last bricks here, including these glazed bricks for the natatorium. And these are selected, or they're developed by Billie, the architect of the building, to enable us to the glazed ceramic. And this is a very difficult process that took them quite a bit of time and effort to do. Now, as we look at the building, you can see the glazed brick is then integrated with the longer plum-colored Norman brick, but it too is not really a brick building. And when you get on the inside, you see the exposed concrete wall. The brick is simply a face. Now, Our last bricks that we'll look at are here at the Cranbrook Guards booth. And this is a project designed by Cranbrook's resident architect, Dan Hoffman, and built by the students in the mid-1990s. I loved exploring in Cranbrook archives and finding this little instance where the cover of the document said a ripped Cranbrook sticker label and then a hand-drawn arrow, brick. And in this brick folder is some 50 pages of glaze recipes. As Cranbrook architecture students worked with Cranbrook ceramic students at the Academy of Art and donated wet or unfired bricks from Belden Brick in Ohio to create glaze recipes, and then to fire bricks in Cranbrook kilns. That's 48 hours of 220 degree temperatures and 34 hours of cooling. And then organizing final brick production, which took place by the students at Belden Brick in Ohio. And we haven't talked much about the chemistry of brick making, but I think this gives you a good sense of the sort of science that goes into creating a glaze. And the result is a clay body brick that is glazed with a copper oxide, giving you this green spotted glaze. And you'll see here that it is this wonderful curving surface set within the larger structure designed by Dan Hoffman and made here at Cranbrook. So after much difficulty, we have arrived back to my favorite brick corner. So our humble bricks, simply a combination of clay and fire, can, I hope I showed you tonight, do monumental things. Cranbrook has been described as having a quiet grandeur. And I think that that grandeur and the whisper in which it often speaks is in no small part because of the small bricks that compose a very large campus. To appreciate any object, to become a connoisseur, even of bricks, the first step is to understand how an object is made and then what the object does. I hope that I have started you on a journey of brick appreciation tonight. And as we circle back to this remarkable composition of common and Roman brick, limestone, concrete, glass, copper, and tile, I just want to repeat this idea and sort of applaud Eliel Saarinen in his ability to create a layered and varied architecture that begins to thread closely right down the middle between tradition and modernity, between the past and between the future, between a familiarity and a newness. It is also, I think, an architecture that is incredibly aspirational. And any artwork or human-made object can embody our aspirations. Our aspirations are what we want, what do we desire, and what do we lack. For George and Ellen Booth, I think their aspiration at Cranbrook was to satisfy a demand for institutions of learning in Michigan and a desire to expand the opportunities for artists and artisans in this country. For the Sarnens, I am sure that designing Cranbrook satisfied the family's aspiration to build. Circling back to Louis Kahn, when he talked about a brick, he was humanizing what is alone just a sort of lump of clay. But when he asked the brick what it wanted to be, what the brick's aspiration was to be, the brick said, "I like an arch." That was the brick's aspiration. Because it isn't an arch as a single brick, but it would like to be one. The brick then embodies the aspirations that I think we all have for a connection, for reaching, for stretching, expanding, and building, for being part of something bigger than ourselves, and for having staying power. And so, as we've seen tonight, the Booths, the Sarnens, and all of the millions of bricks that built Cranbrook are working in relation to what's come before, building for generations into the future, and in so doing, creating their own sort of transcendent of human limits into this great brick architectural landmark that we are lucky enough to occupy for a little amount of time or a long time. Thanks so much for joining me on tonight's Uncovering Cranbrook Bricks of Cranbrook lecture. We have obviously gone well over time now. A question we had this morning was, how do I not know, or how do I know where bricks are from? Shockingly difficult to find out that research. I could tell you where our stone was come from, where our glass was from, our electrical switch plate covers, our laundry machines, our boilers, and yet we have no orders for bricks in Cranbrook archives. And that, I think, reflects both the common nature of brick, that it was thought basically order of the brick the architect wants, and a brick's a brick. But more, it has to do with the legal language of Cranbrook's relationship with our contractor. And Charles Vermouth was procuring our bricks, so those records would be with him, and I was unable to secure those. So we can talk more about how I ended up identifying things like the Wyandotte buckskins and other specific types and names of brick, but it was a lot of research. I am grateful to my colleagues Laura McNewman and Deborah Rice at the archives, as well as Nina Blomfield and Leslie Mayo for helping me with research and photographs. I'm also indebted to Jim Hafner, who photographed many of these beautiful professional images, as well as my student photographers Trist Mallett and Daniel Smith, who photographed many of the pieces, and I'm grateful to Steve Jobs and the iPhone for photographing the rest. Thanks so much for coming out for another Uncovering Cranbrook. Thank you for your patience as we dealt with the internet issues. I have yet to find a corner of Cranbrook that has a stable enough connection for a Zoom lecture, but hopefully one day we will bypass the bricks of Cranbrook with modern Comcast. Until then, though, I will be back with more programming. Stay tuned. Thanks so much, everyone.